Hey there everyone, welcome back to Dan Cave and welcome back to another video build. So this time it's the Italeri 72nd scale AH-1W Super Cobra. I'll try and put it there. Maybe there, maybe there, maybe there. Somewhere. I'll show the box art. So little 72nd scale helicopter. So it's a fairly simple kit. So it's just going to be one part covering the full build process from start to finish. So if you're new here, please subscribe. Really appreciate it. If you like the video, drop a like as well. If you're a returning viewer, of course, don't forget to hit the like button as well. So sit back, put your feet up, and yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy the build. It's not that long, 30 odd minutes, I think. Yeah, let's go straight on into it. I'll come back at the end for some final thoughts about how this build went. See you in a bit. Bye bye. So straight into the end opening box from Italeri, presented with 2 sprues, some loose parts, and a clear sprue as well, which is got which not bagged at all inside the box, which it wasn't originally. So some of these parts were painted many years ago with enamels, probably Humbrol enamels. Paint is obviously well cured now, so it'll just be left and oversprayed as necessary. So work starts on a cockpit. You need to assemble the cockpit before you can put the fuselage together. So I'm going to assemble all the cockpit in basically one piece. It's kind of around here that I realized there's actually a couple of pieces missing. So obviously at some point some parts came off the sprue and have gone walkabout somewhere. No idea where. So there's a front and rear seat, very basic instrument panels, very basic control column. So I'm just straight assembling using extra thin. It's been off to the year spray booth and has been given a coat of, I want to say, gold grey. And then the rest of the details are done using Revell Aqua black for the seats and the surround for the cockpit area, and some olive drab for the seat cushions. So it's a simple case of once that's all painted up, pop that in between the two fuselage halves, and then they could be assembled using some Tamiya extra thin. So just run that into the gap. Make sure to get it all lined up properly, of course. A little bit of pressure will hopefully squeeze out some of the molten glue. That will hopefully aid the cleanup process a little bit later. And then just work your way around all the seams. Just running some of that Tamiya extra thin, and that'll run by capillary action. And that can be set aside to cure for 20 minutes or so. So the next step is there's basically the engine pod, which sits on top of the fuselage. Into that, the rotor assembly gets mounted, and then the two halves can be pushed together. And once again, out with the Tamiya extra thin to glue them together. So far, so good. So again, a little bit of pressure. So once they've had a good 20-30 minutes to cure, you can come back in and see how that upper kind of engine pod and rotor assembly fits onto the main fuselage part. So it's a reasonable fit. It's not great. See already there's probably going to be a little bit of filler needed. But however, that's probably the best the fit is going to be. So once again, a little bit of Tamiya extra thin. Run it into the seam line between the parts. and that cement will instantly start to work on the plastic, basically turn it into molten plastic, and the two parts will be firmly welded together once that's cured. And with Tamiya extra thin, that doesn't take that long at all for that to happen. So once that's been left to cure for a good couple of hours, we can come back and address any of the seams using some UMP thinny sticks. I think this is a UMP 240, 220 thinny stick. Definitely one of my go-to sanding sticks. And that'll definitely help get rid of any presence of seam line. So as the usual process, work our way up through the different grits. I'm also using some Tamiya sanding sponge just to help finish off and smooth out those seams. So again, it's a case of checking what you're doing, see if it's okay, go back and revisit. So once that's all sorted, there's a couple more pieces that go on the forward fuselage. And again, it's the Tamiya extra thin at hand to weld those parts to the main fuselage. So you just want to run that into any of the seam lines, a little bit of pressure, and they'll get nicely cured in place. Engine intakes can be added, of course, at this stage. The fit on these is actually not bad for an older Italeri kit. This is often an area where these type of kits can actually be pretty ropey. Certainly some of the older Italeri F4s, things like that. The intake area can require a lot of work, but these ones are actually not bad. They're not a bad fit. Certainly for a kit of this age, it's not a bad fit. And then of course got a couple of landing skids, which get removed from the sprue, and then a little bit of cleanup with a scalpel blade, just to clean up any of the sprue attachment points. And that can also be used to scrape away any unsightly seams. And then finished off with a sander as necessary. So there's a nice positive fit on these. They sit nicely into the fuselage. Don't really need to seem to need any particular alignment. They seem to sit in quite a natural position. And once again, a little bit of Tamiya extra thin at the two locating points, and that sorts them out. And same operation on the other side. So there's a couple of stub wings, which basically are weapons pylons. So those, as with everything else, are put in place, and some Tamiya extra thin is used to secure them firmly to the fuselage. So they do actually slot in quite securely. Well, a little bit of extra thin, and a quick visual check of the alignment, and that all looks good. So next up is the canopy. So there's no option with this kit to have the canopy open. So pretty much just going to be glued in place. As it doesn't really fail any of the internal components, so there's nothing touching. It's reasonably safe just to use a little bit of Tamiya extra thin to run around the edge of the canopy. Of course, this will give the absolute best kind of weld between the clear parts. But you do have to be very careful that there's nothing close or touching the inside of the canopy glass, because that extra thin will wick its way up and destroy your clear parts. Another thing to be careful of, make sure you don't get any on your fingers. As soon as you go back to touch the canopy to secure it in place, you will get some extra thin on the canopy. And as you can see, I'm just checking a couple of times just to make sure there's nothing on my fingers. So once the canopy is secured in place, left to cure for probably at least 30 minutes, it's time to go back and fill in some of the more unsightly gaps. Now, some of the seams in this are relatively shallow, but they do need a little bit of filling. So I'm going to use some Vallejo putty this time round. So this is basically a water-based putty. It does dry quite hard. It does sand okay, not brilliantly, not as good as any of the solvent-based ones. But one of the benefits of using Vallejo putty is you can basically fill it into the gap that you want, as I'm doing now, just working my way around the canopy edge. It's got a similar texture to decorator's caulk, and it does have a tendency to shrink as well. So once it's filled in, can go back over with a wet cotton bud and remove any excess. Now, this won't bring the seam lines completely flush to the surface, but it will help get rid of the more unsightly ones. And as this is in 70-second scale, and it's a bit of a quick build, I'm not going to dwell on the seam lines too much. As long as I get a little bit of filler in there and it closes up the worst looking gaps, I'll be reasonably happy. Definitely didn't lick that cotton bud. So a little bit of wet on the cotton bud. You can just wipe away any of the excess. You don't want to leave it too long because it will go off, and basically wetting will just pull out all the filler. So you want to try and remove it fairly quickly. But once that's done and I'm happy that those gaps are reasonably well filled, I can go back and mask up the clear parts of the canopy. So the smallest of the Tamiya masking tapes fits quite nicely along the top without any trimming. Just the ends just need to be trimmed using a very sharp scalpel blade. Just at either end. And then of course use a slightly larger piece and then trim around the edge using the scalpel blade. Now this method does come with risk. If you go off in a wrong direction with your knife blade, you will leave a deep cut in your clear part, which will need polishing out or suitably hiding. But if done reasonably carefully, it actually can produce quite good results. But best done where there's a very clear definition of the canopy framing. If it's a bit vague, you do run the risk. But for me, that looks spot on. So of course, with all that masking and filling done, it's time to head over to the spray booth for a little bit of priming. So I've gone with the UMP black primer. So one of the camouflage colors on this particular camouflage scheme that I've gone for is black. So I'm going to use that primer to be that black camouflage color, and then just fill in the gray and the green areas. Now, normally I'd go with probably a gray primer, start off with the lightest of the camouflage colors, and then go to the next darkest, then go to the darkest. But I kind of thought I wanted the black base on the airframe. That gives me a good kind of palette to give a little bit of tonal variation with the gray and the green. And that just helps give a little bit more of a kind of visual effect to how the camouflage will come out. So that's the plan anyway. So let's see how that goes on. So I think overall it's probably had 2 to 3 coats of UMP primer. We'll say 2.5. Once that's had a good couple of hours curing time, I go back in with some Vallejo Model Air, which I think is light ghost grey from recollection. And I'm using the 0.15 Harder and Steenbeck Infinity. Now I have thinned the Model Air. Model Air is allegedly usable straight from the pot in an airbrush, but with a 0.15 needle, it's going to struggle to get through. So a little bit of thinner just gives me a little bit of added control using the 0.15, gives me the best demarcation I'm probably going to get in that scale, certainly using acrylics. Now, obviously, a soft demarcation from an airbrush on a 72nd scale subject is never going to be completely representative of scale. But for me, it does give a good kind of visual effect of certainly how I want this particular helicopter to look. So slowly building up the grey, kind of mottling it on a little bit. That kind of adds to a little bit of colour variation in the grey going over the black. Now that would have been a lot harder to achieve had I gone with a grey primer. So I think I'm quite happy I chose to go with the black primer in this instance. So slowly working my way through from back to front on the helicopter. Once I'm happy with the grey, once that's had some curing time, it's time to go back in with the green colour, which I think is US forest green. And again, same process, Vallejo Model Air, thinned a little bit and using the H&S Infinity with a 0.15 needle. And again, as with the grey, kind of slowly building it up, mottling it a little bit. Again, that just gives a little bit of kind of colour variation in the green, although over the black, the green doesn't give as much kind of colour variation as you see with the grey. And once again, that soft demarcation is left behind by the airbrush. So it can be quite a slow process, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed when doing an airbrush doing an airbrush scheme by hand like this. But I do find the best way to do it is to just do it pretty much panel by panel, side by side. Just kind of slowly work your way, start on one side of the tail, start your kind of key demarcation, fill it in, move your way forward, move your way around to the other side, join up the areas that you've laid down, but work slowly, methodically. Always be a little bit cautious of overspray. Not so much of a problem on this kit, but on bigger kits, just watch the angles you're coming in with the airbrush, because you can easily get some overspray in areas where you don't really want it. But overall, it's just a slow process of building up that colour and gradually getting it to the point where we've got the three key camouflage colours of the grey, the green and the black. And as you can see on the underside of the engine, there is a little bit of overspray from grey, but I will go back to sort that out with some Vallejo Model Air Black. So it's quite an enjoyable process. I do find that it can be quite time consuming. I do sometimes find that you sit there and you almost hold your breath while you're doing it. So it can be quite exhausting because you're kind of slowly and patiently trying to get that colour down. Plus, of course, acrylics through an airbrush, particularly this size, you will suffer from tip dry. So for me, I always keep either a cotton bud or a paintbrush with some thinners on it nearby. Every time I do a couple of passes, just go over, clean off any dried paint off the end of the needle. The needle is very easy to get on the H&S. You just need to remember to do it. It becomes part of that almost muscle memory to do it when working with acrylics. So once the green has had a little bit of drying time, I go back in with some Model Air Black. Again, thinned with UMP thinners and using the 0.15 in the Infinity again. So all I'm trying to do at this stage is basically clean up any overspray. There'll be a little bit of overspray in some of the kind of edges, nooks and crannies. Just kind of get in there with some Model Air Black, just clean that up. Plus the Model Air Black going on last gives me a chance to clean up any of the demarcations as well, because some of them have come out a little bit softer between the grey and black transition than I wanted. So I can just clean that up with a little bit of Model Air Black. So once again, it's been thinned probably 30% with UMP thinners, and it's going through the H&S Infinity with the 0.15 needle at about 20 psi. At least 20 psi on the gauge. That's on my compressor. So whatever that is in reality, I don't know. But certainly the paint goes through and it goes down reasonably well. So again, it's just careful, slow process, cleaning up any of that overspray area and cleaning up the demarcations. Now, what's probably not visible on the video is the Model Air Black is a slightly different black color to the UMP black. So that does give a little bit of visual kind of difference, a bit of tonal difference between the two blacks. So that does add to the kind of overall effect. And for me, kind of complements the little bit of variation that's in the green and then the variation that's in the grey as well. So it's just that methodical, slow process, clean up the demarcations and clean up any overspray. So once the black is done, the model can be set aside for about 24 hours, plenty of curing time, and it's time to get the decals on. Now, these are the original decals from the kit. I think I bought this kit back in probably late 90s. So it sat in my stash for quite a long time. It's been through countless house moves. It's been stored in countless attics. But the decals go straight on to the bare paint finish. No gloss coat. It's not needed. So all you need to do is make sure the decals are warmed in warm water. They release from the backing paper absolutely fine. Set them in place. Remove any excess with a cotton bud. And then apply a little bit of decal solution. And I think I've used a combination of UMP normal and UMP strong. Now, because there's not complex panel lines, I don't really need to melt them into any detailed panel lines. The normal and the strong are absolutely fine and absolutely strong enough to get these to sit to the surface with no silvering. So there's not a huge number of decals in this kit. There's a couple of stars and bars. Go on the forward end. A couple of marines logos, text bits that go on the boom, and then a few serial numbers around the airframe. So it's not a huge decal job, but they do go down absolutely fine and have stood the test of time, including numerous extended stays in attics, garages, probably sheds as well over the years. And as you can see, they just sit down absolutely fine. But obviously, you need to wait until they dry completely to check for any silvering. But in this case, there has been none. Perfectly happy with how these decals have performed. Now, the carrier film is a little bit visible. Subsequent clear coats will help clear that up. Pardon the pun. Will help disguise that carrier film and get it to blend into the background perfectly nicely. So again, a little bit of UMP strong, normal or strong, one or the other, used just to help them conform to what little panel detail is there. So that can be set aside. Decals are then let cure for a while. So there's a few other bits and pieces that need to be done. Stuff like the rotors, the weapons, the gun itself, all those things need to be primed, and pretty much everything gets primed in UMP black. And then for things like the tail rotor, the mechanism on the tail rotor, that can get probably brush painted. But at this stage, get that primer coat down. So those other parts are set aside. They've been fully painted up. Decals have been settled in. I think I've given it a coat of Winsor Newton Galleria satin. So that sealed everything in. And now I'm just going to use a mixture of some oil paints, very cheap oil paints, I will say, and some Sansador odorless mineral spirits, just to add a little bit of weathering. So the main kind of areas I'm aiming for are basically in and around the top side of the boom, in and around the engine areas, just to add a little bit of a kind of grimy filter to those areas. There's not going to be a panel line wash on this because there's not really any panel lines. The ones that are there are pretty much raised, but I do want to give a little bit of a grimier kind of finish to that boom area. So I'm kind of doing different areas, mixture of black and I think it's either sienna or burnt umber, mixing them together, mixing in a little bit of Ammo Mig oil brusher as well, just to give a couple of different colors, getting them down onto the surface, and then basically using a larger brush just to blend them together a little bit, and it gives quite a good kind of filtering effect. So it is very, for me, it's very easy to overdo weathering in 70-second scale. I think what has to be done is a little bit more subtle. I think certainly if you're doing a panel line wash, try and avoid strong contrast colors. For me, that doesn't look appropriate in 70-second scale. So what I tend to try and do is pick out key areas where I want to have a little bit of color difference. And as you can see, that gray color on the tail boom looks a noticeably darker shade than the forward end of the airframe. So just to complement what's done, I'm going back in with a cotton bud with some Sansador on it, just to blend a few areas together and just to clear off a few areas, so it gives plenty of kind of color variation. Now, I've chosen to use a little bit of grey in the mix of this oil wash as well. That helps give a little bit of color variation on the black as well. And hopefully that gives more of an impression of an area of the airframe that will sit in basically the hot exhaust blast. It's not going to be hugely kind of smoked out or burnt. I mean, ultimately, it's a helicopter. They're turbofan engines. So we just want a little bit of variation. So once that's done, basically a case of looking for a couple of other key areas to add a small amount of oil paint. I want to give a little bit of streaking effect in a few areas, a little bit of kind of wear, smudging on a few areas like the leading edge of the skids. In and around any of the canopy areas, there's always going to be a little bit of kind of color difference where, you know, crew have gained access, people have stood on it. I'm trying to be restrained with the level of contrast I want. So really, I'm just looking for a very, very translucent filter effect. And then in and around areas like the engine, I'll probably add a little bit of streaking as well, just to show potential areas where, you know, kind of fuels, oils, greases may have spilt, which is exactly what I'm doing here. So just a couple of little spots here and there around any access panels. Given that the level of detail on, you know, certainly the panel line detailing and the kind of intake and grills and stuff around the engine is pretty vague and undefined on this kit, I'm just adding a little bit just to add just a little bit of an effect. So there we can see that's the final kind of weathered product. Reasonably happy with that. I think I've gotten probably the desired amount of kind of color variation that I want. And once I'm completely happy with it, it's time to lay down basically a matte coat. just to dull everything down a little bit. So I'm using Ammo Mig's Lucky Varnish Ultra Matte, which does produce an incredibly matte finish. They are very fragile, the one thing I found, but as a final top coat, there's not going to be a huge amount of work done on this airframe after this, so I'm not too worried about how fragile it is. So just a couple of coats of matte. This stuff dries incredibly quickly as well, so I feel reasonably happy to pick it up in the manner I've shown on video using a glove. And once that's had a good 12 hours to cure, I can go back in and remove the masking tape from the canopy areas. Of course, it's at this point, looking at a canopy, I kind of remember how little there is in the cockpit and actually how bare it looks. It's slightly disappointed I didn't kind of add a little bit of detail to the cockpit. But howsever, that was the decision I made. So there's a couple of external bits to add. So the rotors have been added, weapons have been added, and the exhausts have been added. And then there's one little detail on top of the fuselage, a little bit of red paint. And then that is the finished kit. So a very quick build, a very quick run through, and these are the final photos of how that kit has come out. So it's a tiny little model, it really is. But I have to say, I quite enjoyed building it, quite pleased with the finish I've got on it. In 70-second scale, I think the paintwork has come out quite good. So on that final picture, let's go back to me for final thoughts. So there we go. That's the AH-1W Super Cobra completed. So as you can see, it's a 30-odd minute video because ultimately it's a relatively simple kit from Italeri. Not a huge amount of cockpit detail. Decided not really to do anything with the cockpit. Hindsight, maybe could have been given a little bit, maybe some seat belts, something just to add a little bit of kind of visual interest in there, because the glazing is quite large, so you can see quite a lot. So could have been, could have done a little bit. This kit was kind of laying about the cave for quite a while, so kind of wanted to get it done. Quite enjoyed it. Relatively simple build. The kit itself is not great, it's a little bit of filler used in it, not a ridiculous amount, but the kit itself, it kind of lacks quality. It's a little bit dated now. You're talking about a 35-year-old kit, give or take. So that's getting on a bit, and kits have improved a lot since those days. So lacks a bit of detail, lacks some finesse. But it went together okay. Reasonably happy with it. A little bit of freehand camo with the airbrush. Not the finest work I've done, but it seemed to come out okay. For me, it kind of gives across the right tones of what I look for in that kind of camouflage scheme for that helicopter. So reasonably pleased with the outcome. Relatively straightforward build and an enjoyable video build to do. So hopefully you've enjoyed it as well. If you have done, don't forget to pop a like. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe as well. It'd be greatly appreciated. And of course, don't forget to comment as well. If you have any comments about the build or any questions or anything of that nature, feel free to pop one in the comments field below. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all very soon in the next video, whatever that may be. Take care. See you later. Bye bye.